People, the people of the Wabanaki kinship, the traditional life ways of the Western Abenaki of New Hampshire and Vermont, written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. The Western Abenaki evolved their culture under the bowers of the rich and varied tapestry of old-growth forest that once blanketed the northeast region. If we could experience even one day of the incredible bounty and biodiversity of that world, it would blow our minds and break our hearts to understand what was lost when the forests were destroyed. The people of the Dawn lived within the pre-colonial landscape by patterning their cultural practices upon the principle of reciprocity with all the other living beings. They hunted, trapped, foraged, fished, and farmed according to the turn of the seasons. They did not understand themselves as being apart from the living web of ancient forest that cloaked their world. Their cultural language revolved around relationality with their forest home. Harsh winters necessitated a culture of storage foods, the procurement and processing of which the people were experts. From smoked salmon, jerked venison, parched maize, squashes, dried beans and berries, Jerusalem artichoke, and many other edible roots and tubers, sunflower seeds, beech nut, hickory nut, butternut, walnut, chestnut, and acorn meal, birch and maple sugar. The list is long, and that variety helped ensure there was always something to eat, even in lean years. Tobacco was cultivated for use in ceremony. Pemmican was an important stored food for extended travel and for surviving the long winters. Made from tallow and dried meat, kneaded into loaves with crushed and dried berries, it was a nutrient-dense superfood. The forest provided the people with pharmacopoeia of medicines and all the materials they needed to make the tools, clothing, and shelter necessary to live a comfortable life. Theirs was a true circular economy and a zero-waste society. When the settlers arrived in the place they named New England, they described it as a wilderness, even though it was home to several 100,000 ecologically sophisticated souls. Recent estimates put the Western Abenaki pre-settlement population in present-day New Hampshire and Vermont at 40,000. The impression of an empty land was also a consequence of what has been dubbed the Great Dying, when 75 to 90% of the indigenous coastal populations were wiped out by European diseases, first contracted from English cod fishermen who had begun plying the waters off the coast of Maine 100 years prior to the settlement at Plymouth. The first Puritan town on Cape Cod was built upon a Wampanoag village that had been erased by plague. The Europeans carried zoonotic pathogens contracted from their domestic livestock. They had developed immunity after a millennia of close association with their cows, sheep, chickens, and pigs. Indigenous people had zero immunity to highly communicable diseases like smallpox and measles. Many of the first agricultural settlements in the river valleys were made upon occupied land called the Old Fields, which were the former planting grounds of the indigenous people who had been annihilated by disease. For 1,000 years, people had been growing corn, squash, and beans in the rich alluvial soils of the Connecticut River basin. It is estimated that at the time of first contact, the people of southern New England obtained 80% of their food calories from the cultivation of maize. We can form a picture of land caretakership in the colonial times through the oral traditions handed down to us by the present-day Abenaki, from contemporary accounts of Europeans and indigenous people, and from the archaeological record. What we begin to understand is that the people of the northern woodlands aren't easily put into a box. They weren't a settled people, and neither were they complete nomads. Theirs was a life of seasonal migration within fluid territories inhabited by their ancestors for millennia. They weren't solely hunter-gatherers, nor were they fully settled agriculturalists. The term horticulturalist might at times apply. Their cultivation of annual crops was part of a continuum of land care that drew no hard lines of separation between annual and perennial, garden and forest. Well-worn footpaths served as highways to farming grounds, fishing grounds, hunting grounds, and sacred sites. Although their antiquity is contested by some archaeologists, the eastern woodland cultures constructed stone chambers, often within a circle of standing stones or cairns, marking solstices and equinoxes and other celestial events. Travel was facilitated upon lakes and rivers by lightweight birch bark canoes. Pathways also served as invaluable trade routes. The archaeological record includes items of turquoise from the southeast and hammered copper from the Great Lakes. People living in the far north woods, where it was too cold to plant crops, but excellent for trapping, traded furs with their southern kin in exchange for parched corn. These northern Abenaki hunters had a prescribed rotation of hunting grounds to avoid tapping too heavily on any given area. Distinct landscapes were managed with controlled burning to favor plants that supplied food, medicine, crafting, and building materials. Mast-bearing trees like chestnut, acorn, hickory, and walnut were planted and cultivated as food forests. An understory of soft-mast canes, bushes, and shrubs were encouraged by periodic low-intensity burning as both a food source for humans and to favor game animals such as white-tailed deer and turkey. Where farming of domesticated crops was practiced, it was a sophisticated polyculture of fields managed with fallow rotation periods in the fertile bottomlands of the river valleys or old beaver meadows. When fire was used to clear land for crops, a form of biochar was made in place through slow-burning piles of greenwood. It has long been held that pre-settlement agricultural clearings were temporary phases within forest succession, and that, once abandoned, the return of successional woody shrubs and trees contributed to the wealth of habitat diversity engendered by natural cycles of disturbance and regeneration in the old forests. While this may have formed part of the picture, there is no hard evidence to confirm that eastern woodland peoples regularly practiced swidden agriculture, pejoratively referred to as slash and burn, as is still common today in many parts of Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. In the tropics, when human population is proportionate to the land base, small plots are cleared out of jungle, farmed for 2 years, and then abandoned for 20, which provides ample time for swiftly growing trees to reach maturity, to the point where it is impossible to discern that the area had ever been cleared. Such systems can be maintained sustainably for thousands of years. In temperate New England, it would take 60 to 80 years to get anywhere near that stage of forest recovery, and to date there is no conclusive archaeological proof that such rotations were practiced. Indeed, many of the old fields that were appropriated by the Europeans were quite extensive and had been cleared of stones and tree roots, suggesting long-term tenure. Further, they were not situated in proximity to matching swaths of forest that could serve as stages within a long-term rotation typical of shifting agriculture. What seems more likely is that indigenous farmers cultivated permanent fields and developed methods for maintaining fertility, likely with inputs such as fish, ground shells, seaweed, biochar applications, and the burning of resurgent broom grass after a 1 or 2 year fallow, and perhaps application of night soil, as was practiced in Mesoamerica. A select number of desirable food crop trees would likely have been left standing as integral components within the annual crop field systems. At the time of first contact, the indigenous people were still co-evolving their culture with this landscape and moving toward greater complexity of relationship. Western culture has typically described such cultures as primitive. In reality, the ecological literacy and nuanced sophistication of the indigenous agrobiodiverse woodland society that existed here for at least 1,000 years was nothing short of a supreme collective human achievement. Today, Abenaki band members and their allies are recovering, reviving, and building on this vital cultural legacy.